When you walk past a massive urban construction site, your senses are just immediately hijacked.
Oh, absolutely. It's so loud.
Right? You hear that deafening roar of the diesel excavators, tearing into the earth, and you smell that sharp, alkaline tang of curing concrete in the air.
Yeah, you really can't ignore it.
Exactly.
Hmm.
You look up and see these massive steel I-beams swinging gracefully through the sky on cranes. It is this intensely physical, undeniably real experience. But what if I told you that long before a single scoop of dirt was ever moved, long before a single physical brick was laid, that entire towering structure is already built?
Right.
I mean, completely built out of communication.
Yeah, it really requires a massive shift in how we perceive our built environment. Because, we look at a skyscraper or a museum as a physical object, obviously, but its genesis is entirely immaterial.
Totally.
A building begins as this ongoing, highly complex, and honestly highly contested.
And our goal here isn't just to, list off the software that architects use. We want to explore how digital tools like CAD, BIM, and those jaw-dropping photorealistic rendering engines actually work.
Right, because they don't just change how a building is drawn.
Exactly. They fundamentally alter how it is conceived, pitched, and ultimately built. We're looking at how the illusion of digital perfection changes the very nature of design, and why, even in an era of near infinite processing power, the ultimate indispensable tool still remains human judgment.
Which is a dynamic you don't really see in other fields, to be honest. Architecture is a strangely fractured discipline.
How so?
Well, an architect has to communicate the exact same spatial concept to vastly different audiences, often on the exact same day.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess that's true.
Right, so in the morning, they are speaking to a structural engineer who, demands absolute unforgiving mathematical precision. But then in the evening, they're standing in front of a community board, speaking to people who primarily need to know how a space is going to feel.
And whether it's going to completely ruin the character of their neighborhood.
Exactly. The engineer needs to know the exact load-bearing capacity of a steel column down to the millimeter.
But the neighbor just wants to know if the new tower is going to, block the morning sun from hitting their tomato garden.
Yeah, and that tension is the core of the job. And I think the baseline we have to establish here is that the digital turn hasn't actually solved those core problems of representation.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, architects still have to translate abstract ideas of form, space, scale, and materiality into something legible.
Right, they still have to tell the story.
Exactly. What the software has done is just drastically mutate the speed, the range, and the sheer complexity of the imagery they generate to solve those problems.
So to understand how we communicate a building's vision, we really need to look at the digital bones of the project first.
Yeah, that's a good place to start.
Let's start with that transition from hand drafting to CAD. My immediate thought is that moving to CAD is essentially like moving from a typewriter to a modern word processor. You suddenly have a backspace key, you can copy and paste.
I'd actually challenge that word processor analogy, if you don't mind.
Oh, sure. Why is that?
Because, well, a word processor primarily just formats text faster. CAD fundamentally restructures how the architect conceptually organizes the project.
Okay, I'm listening.
So for centuries, if you were drafting by hand, every single line required intense physical deliberation. I mean, if a client wanted to move a masonry wall 3 feet to the left, you were literally scraping ink off vellum with a razor blade.
Oh, wow. Or just starting over completely.
Right. So CAD obviously eliminated that physical friction, but its true power lies in the absolute control of geometry and measurable relationships.
Right, because you're no longer relying on a human hand to, hold a T-square perfectly straight.
Exactly. But beyond the straight lines, it introduced this whole concept of infinite layering.
Okay, wait, I want to pause on layering, because it sounds like we're just talking about a digital filing cabinet, but it feels like it's much deeper than that. Is it more like isolating the systems of the human body? Like you have the skeleton layer, the nervous system layer, and then the skin layer?
That is a much more accurate way to look at it, yeah. In a complex CAD file, the architect isolates the structural columns on one layer, which is the skeleton.
Right.
The electrical wiring and HVAC ducts are on another, so that's the nervous system. And the interior partitions, the furniture, the landscaping, they all exist on independent planes.
So it's all separated out?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this allows the architect to instantly toggle visibility. You can strip away the skin and the furniture to show the structural engineer only what they need to see. You are establishing graphic hierarchy through isolation.
But earlier you mentioned the illusion of digital perfection. If CAD is this incredibly precise, perfectly isolated anatomy of a building, where is the illusion? I mean, just because you can type 100 words a minute doesn't mean you're writing a good novel, right?
Yeah, you're touching on the primary trap of the software right there. Because CAD completely eliminates the physical friction of drawing, it creates a really dangerous illusion of clarity.
How so?
Well, the software allows you to zoom in infinitely and draw 1,000 perfectly straight, mathematically precise lines. So students and even seasoned professionals will produce these drawings that are technically dense, but kind of conceptually bankrupt.
So the software is doing the drawing, but nobody is actually doing the thinking.
Pretty much. The software's logic ends up overriding the architectural intent. I mean, if you turn on all those layers at once, the skeleton, the nervous system, the furniture, and you hit print, you don't get a building.
What do you get?
You get a black sea of unreadable ink. The architect still has to make a critical human decision about what is primary in this drawing, what needs to recede into the background.
Right, what line weights actually communicate the difference between a heavy concrete wall and a pane of glass?
Exactly. CAD gives you precise geometry, but it absolutely does not give you communication.
Which I think brings us to BIM. If CAD is drawing the anatomy of the building, reading the source material about BIM makes it sound like we are simulating the actual living biology of the building before it's even constructed.
Oh yeah, BIM is a total paradigm shift. Traditional CAD is ultimately just digital line work. It's an abstraction.
Like two parallel lines represent a wall.
Right. But in BIM, you are building a deeply integrated, data-rich model. You aren't drawing lines anymore. You are actually placing a defined building component into a virtual space.
So the software actually knows it's a wall.
It knows it's a wall, and it carries an enormous payload of metadata. That digital wall knows its exact physical thickness, its material composition, its acoustic rating, its structural load capacity, and even like its real-time cost based on current supply chain data.
That is insane. But that immediately raises a red flag for me, to be honest.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, doesn't BIM kind of force you into a box? If I'm an architect under a super tight deadline, aren't I just going to grab a pre-made standard wall assembly from the software's default library rather than taking the time to design a bespoke detail?
That's a very valid concern.
Doesn't this immense data processing power actually risk homogenizing design? Like making every new office building look exactly the same?
Yeah, that is the silent compromise happening in commercial studios all over the world right now, unfortunately. The efficiency of the default library is incredibly seductive.
I can imagine.
However, the counterargument is that BIM allows for a level of coordination that was just historically impossible. Think about clash detection.
Clash detection.
Yeah, so in the past, using just 2D CAD drawings, an architect might accidentally route a major air conditioning duct right through the exact same space where the structural engineer placed a massive steel beam.
Oh no, and you wouldn't discover that mistake until you were standing on the construction site?
Exactly, bleeding money, with a furious contractor yelling at you.
And BIM solves that.
BIM flags that collision in bright red on your screen 6 months before ground is ever broken. The electrical, structural, and architectural models are completely synchronized.
That's amazing.
Yeah, if you move a wall on the first floor, the floor plan updates, the section view updates, the window schedule updates, and the structural load calculates the change instantly.
Wow.
But again, a synchronized data model is not a narrative. You cannot just hand a 500-page clash detection report to a mayor and expect them to fund your project.
Right, because nobody falls in love with an HVAC coordination schedule.
Exactly.
So if CAD and BIM provide the cold, hard logic and the physical facts of a building, how do architects actually convey the emotion?
Well, they transition from data to visual persuasion. And this is the domain of the photorealistic rendering. Rendering simulates atmosphere.
Okay, let's unpack this because here is where it gets really interesting to me. We are moving from absolute measurable truth into something that's entirely subjective.
Right.
You can show the precise shadows creeping across a facade at like 4:00 p.m. in late November. You can simulate the warmth of sunlight hitting reclaimed timber or the way morning fog rolls over a concrete plaza. It's like experiencing the mood of a space before the foundation is even poured.
And because it taps directly into human sensory experience, rendering has become the undisputed king of architectural communication. I mean, a floor plan is essentially a foreign language to the general public.
It requires spatial translation.
Exactly. But a rendering of a sunlit reading room, with dust motes dancing in the light and people quietly studying, you don't have to translate that. It compresses highly complex geometric and spatial data into one instantly desirable reality.
But the word desirable is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Are you saying a stunning rendering of a sunset reflecting off a beautiful glass curtain wall could essentially just be a smokescreen for a terrible floor plan?
Unfortunately, yes. The source material refers to this exact phenomenon as the aesthetic veil.
It's aesthetic veil.
Yeah. Because our brains process light, shadow, and texture so much faster than geometric logic, the rendering carries a massive risk of deception. They frequently cross the line from disciplined representations of a project into just pure architectural fantasy.
So the building would literally fail as a functional space, but the sunset looks gorgeous.
I see it constantly, both in academic critiques and in professional pitches. A designer will spend 40 hours perfecting the ray trace lighting, tweaking the reflectivity of the glass, adding lens flares to an image.
And ignoring the actual building.
Exactly. The underlying structural logic is entirely unresolved. The circulation of the building makes no sense, or there are columns sitting right in the middle of hallways, but the image is breathtaking.
That's wild.
Strong renderings really must be earned by a project that already works architecturally. The image should amplify the clarity of the floor plan. It should never compensate for its confusion.
So the architect is basically sitting there with the precise, logical line work of CAD and BIM on one screen, and these highly emotional, atmospheric renderings on the other. It feels like we're dealing with two entirely different languages.
These really are.
How do you actually put all these pieces together to tell a cohesive story? I mean, you can't just throw a spreadsheet and a sunset at a client and hope they figure it out.
No, you definitely can't. That assembly process is what we call visual narrative, and it functions as a highly structured form of editorial design. The architect has to act as a curator of their own data.
Like putting together an exhibit.
Right. They take conceptual diagrams, exploded isometric views, precise floor plans, and emotional renderings, and they arrange them into a sequence.
It sounds a lot like being a movie director. You have to decide when to give the audience a wide establishing shot, like a site diagram, to show where the building lives in the broader city.
Yes, exactly.
And then you have to know when you need to jump cut to a tight close-up on the material details, like how the raw steel meets the polished glass.
The director analogy is highly accurate, actually, particularly regarding pacing and cognitive load, because the digital environment makes it dangerously easy to overwhelm your audience.
Saw that.
You have infinite colors, infinite line weights, and literally an infinite number of camera angles you could generate from the 3D model. If you throw all that information onto a presentation board simultaneously, it just becomes visually exhausting.
The eye doesn't know where to go.
Exactly, and the communication fails entirely.
So how do you manage that cognitive load? What does the editing process actually look like in practice?
It requires severe restraint, honestly, and a strong graphic hierarchy. If everything on the page is bold, nothing is bold. You manage it by using scale intentionally. Perhaps your core concept diagram takes up half the page, while the supporting structural plans are much smaller. You manage it through white space, giving the viewer's eye a place to rest between complex technical drawings.
That makes sense.
And you also manage it through tonal contrast. You might present a very rhythmic, measured sequence of stark black and white floor plans, and then, right when the viewer understands the logic, you hit them with a full bleed, saturated rendering to punctuate the presentation emotionally.
Pacing the emotional hits. I love that. But you also have to know who is sitting in the dark theater watching your movie. The director isn't going to show the same cut of the film to a focus group that they show to a studio executive.
Audience adaptation is critical. The beauty of the digital model is that it allows for multiple distinct outputs from a single source. But you really have to tailor the story.
So you wouldn't show a BIM model to everyone.
Oh, definitely not. A highly technical layered BIM section drawing is essential to reassure your mechanical consultant. But if you put that on a projector at a town hall meeting, you will lose the room immediately.
They just fall asleep.
Exactly. Conversely, a slick photorealistic rendering might make a wealthy client swoon and sign a check, but an architectural critic or a zoning judge is going to look right past the lens flare and demand to see the conceptual rigor in the plan.
Wow, so true.
Showing everything you have produced is just a failure of communication. Showing the right things in the right sequence to the exact right audience, that is the mastery of the craft.
The ability to edit and tailor these stories has never been faster. A firm can change a wall in BIM, update the rendering in the cloud, and tweak the presentation layout in hours instead of weeks. That velocity has to introduce massive new pressures into the industry, right? Fast output is not the same thing as deep understanding.
That is a huge issue. The tempo of design has accelerated to a breakneck pace, and it creates a very specific trap.
What kind of trap?
Well, because architectural drawings and images can be produced and revised so rapidly, the iterative cycle never really stops. The pressure to constantly produce new outputs for client meetings can encourage premature surface-level polish.
Oh, I see.
The architect starts relying on what the software can generate automatically, rather than pausing to deeply consider the spatial, physical implications of what they're drawing. The tool literally begins to dictate the thinking.
So how do the truly great architects avoid getting sucked into that automated void?
Surprisingly, the most powerful communication strategies today often involve what we call hybrid practice.
Hybrid practice?
Yeah, the best designers actively disrupt the digital workflow by injecting analog methods back into the process.
Wait, really? With all of this incredible multi-million-dollar technology at their fingertips, they're going back to tracing paper and charcoal. Why would they do that?
Because of the cognitive psychology of ambiguity. Digital tools really struggle with ambiguity. A perfect digitally rendered line or a high-resolution image feels finished. It feels locked in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
When you show a client a photorealistic rendering, their brain registers it as a photograph of something that already exists. They think, oh, it's done, I can't touch it. But a design process is an evolving, fragile thing. A charcoal sketch or a physical cardboard model is an invitation to collaborate.
Because the brain has to fill in the gaps.
Exactly. When a client looks at a smudged charcoal line, they see potential. They feel comfortable saying, hey, what if we push this wall back? It leaves the design open to interpretation.
So they mix the two.
Yes, so today you'll frequently see architects scan a rough hand sketch into a slick digital presentation, or they'll overlay precise CAD line work on top of a photograph of a messy physical model. It maintains the human touch and prevents that false sense of finality that digital perfection imposes.
That concept of a false sense of finality leads us directly into what feels like the most vital issue we face today, and that's the ethics of digital persuasion. I really want to push on this.
Okay, let's get into it.
If an architect is preparing for a hostile zoning board meeting, and they strategically add like lush 50-year-old oak trees into a rendering of a project that hasn't even been built yet,
Right.
and they soften the shadows so the building doesn't look as imposing, aren't they basically fictionalizing reality? Where is the line between selling a compelling vision and straight up deceiving the public?
It is the defining ethical question of digital representation, honestly. We have to remember that these architectural images do not exist in an academic vacuum. They are highly weaponized tools of persuasion that influence massive allocations of capital and public resources.
Wow.
They determine how zoning laws are bypassed, how public housing is approved or denied, and how entire urban landscapes are fundamentally altered.
People's actual lives, their daily commutes, the sunlight on their street, all of that is directly impacted by what is shown in that digital image.
Which is why the stakes are so high. Digital tools make it incredibly easy to make a controversial project appear significantly greener, socially vibrant, and contextually gentler than its physical reality will ever be.
Yeah, you can just add some trees.
Exactly. You can hide a problematic, overwhelming facade behind digitally generated trees that won't actually reach maturity for half a century. You can populate a rendering with happy, diverse people interacting warmly in a public plaza that, in reality, is going to be a windswept, shadowed concrete slab.
It honestly feels like an erosion of public trust.
It is a massive breach of trust if it's not handled ethically. But ethical architectural communication doesn't mean your presentation has to be ugly or uninspiring. It just means that the atmosphere, the materials, and the human occupation you depict must arise from plausible structural realities. It has to reflect actual architectural intentions, not cheap post-production tricks applied in Photoshop to camouflage a bad design. The image must clarify the truth of the project, not fictionalize it beyond recognition.
Man, let's bring all this together for you listening, because we have covered incredible ground today. We've explored how digital tools have completely rewired how we imagine and share our built environment.
We really have.
We started with CAD and BIM, which give architects this rigorous, data-driven control over geometry, clash detection, and construction facts. We looked at how rendering provides the emotional resonance, using simulated light and material to bypass logic and speak directly to our desires. And we saw how visual narrative is the editorial restraint that weaves that data and emotion into a coherent story.
And through all of that technological evolution, the core lesson remains unchanged. Software can automate production, but it cannot replicate architectural intelligence.
Right.
A computer program does not possess critical graphic judgment or an ethical compass. The human architect must still make the difficult decisions. They have to decide what is worth showing, how to manage cognitive load, and how to balance technical precision with honest persuasion.
It really is the invisible building before the physical one. Which brings me back to where we started. Next time you walk past a construction site and you stop to look up at that glossy, perfect billboard showing the future of your neighborhood, I want you to pay close attention.
I'm done.
Look at that glowing golden hour sunset. Look at the idealized people sipping coffee on the perfectly lit terrace. And ask yourself, what physical reality might that beautiful sunset be hiding?
That's a great question.
But take it one step further. We are standing right on the edge of generative AI and augmented reality. Think about what happens to our cities when the architect isn't even the one designing that sunset.
Oh, that's a scary thought.
What happens when an algorithm learns to automatically generate the most psychologically persuasive, irresistible image of a building, tailored specifically to your personal data profile?